And I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Alex Bastian, who's Vice President of Commercial Strategy and BD at Memo Therapeutics, to speak about moving fast and not breaking things, how to run an efficient and decluttered market access function. Alex?
Thanks. Hopefully everybody's not come down yet from the lunch, glucose bolus that you had. I have a pretty cool topic to talk to you about today, and that's how we do things fast, right? Not break them. For some of you were at last year's conference, and I promise there's new slides here, a whole new approach to it. But I do have a couple questions for folks. I'm going to provide some context to the renal market or the area, what makes renal, specifically interesting for a variety of folks. But then I'm also going to get into sort of the, environment that we're in, the way that it's changing, the way that we approach biotech agility in our day-to-day practice. And there's things that you can implement in the real world in your big pharmaceutical companies, which leads me to my first question. How many are at companies with more than 150 employees?
More or less?
More or less. You tell me. Let's start with more. Who has more? Yeah. Okay. Well, who has less than 150 then? Okay, so 2 people. All right. Maybe 3. All right. So everybody's kind of big company minded here. And then who works in the renal therapeutic area? Anybody? So 2, 3. Okay, so a few people. Right? Who's in a global role? Okay, so a lot of global folks, this is good. All right. So what I'll do, just because there's a lot of folks in the room that aren't renal, I'll talk a little bit about what makes renal specific, because most major companies have an investment in renal, right? But renal's sort of an amorphous term, right? It deals with cardiovascular, cancer, infectious disease. It's all over the place. And a lot of people see it like a canary in the coal mine. If something's wrong in your kidney, there might be something wrong in the overall system. So they use it a lot of the time for an early detection system or organ for a lot of different, let's say, therapeutic areas. But because of that, it also blends into a variety of different areas where you see different concerns pop up. Specifically here, it is something that is not going to go away. You see the majority of the population getting to older age. Older age people have more renal disorders. These renal disorders are going to continue to have a massive impact on the population. But it can also not just be at the broad population level, it can also be a rare disease concern. So here you see an example of some acute versus chronic, some rare versus non-rare. There's a variety of things, and these all go in the grab bag of renal, right? But renal can be so many different things. And so I think when you start to look at the nuance of renal therapeutic areas, you have to look at what is actually specific to that, disease indication and what is something broadly applicable. And I'll tell you a few of those right now. So some of the challenges are that surrogate endpoints are often relied upon across these, whether it's rare or chronic. Things like EGFR, serum creatinines are not necessarily always valued by payers, albeit being extremely important to clinicians as they're managing patients on a day-to-day basis. As a result, the non-surrogate outcomes usually require long follow-up. So what does that create? Lots of uncertainty in any of your models and your propositions that you bring forward to payers, right? You think down the long term, it may improve the rates of return to dialysis, or it may improve patients that are in CKD. But again, there's some leaps of faith that need to be made here. The other thing is site of care varies, right? So when you're getting a kidney transplant, you're in an institutionalized setting. When you're out in a long-term care facility, it's very different from an outpatient setting. And so you get these changes of setting that impact the way that the drugs are often reimbursed. Sometimes in capitated environments where there's a single lump sum payment, like a tariff or a DRG. Sometimes it's outpatient buy and bill. Sometimes these are chronic medications given in pills for large supplies over long term. But these things impact the way we look at it, and it also impacts it because we look at how you would reimburse the product in terms of how you price the product, right? Elderly people often have multiple comorbidities. That makes it challenging to run clinical trials. So you get all these weird adverse events that pop up. You have to worry about drug-drug interactions. There's a lot of different things that you have to worry about with renal clinical trials. That said, there's some really good things, right? There's opportunities. There's a public priority put around a lot of these renal diseases. Transplantation, for instance, has a wait list of 90,000 people in the United States, right? It takes 5 years to get a kidney. When you get one, you won the lottery, right? There's also really great public databases for most of these. They created these databases to help with the public challenges around policy, but that gives us really great data assets for looking at patients and sort of their outcomes in the real world. Great benchmarks, great mining of information, even in terms of targeting your populations. And last but not least, it is well organized. So if you look at the advocacy groups, except for some of the small, super rare ones that are coming out today, you actually have pretty good advocates that are willing to fight for patients with kidney disease. So all these things considered, there are reasons why it's great for biotech, right? We can have a relatively, let's say, flat organization that we engage with these different groups with, so you cut out some of the BS, right? In big companies, sometimes it's an ownership issue. Is it medical's job? Is it access's job? Who drives it? Is there a patient person who wants to own that relationship? In a small organization, we don't have that same pressure. There are also these registries. We've worked a lot with them. They often don't cost a lot of money to tap into. And so using that for data generation purposes is a huge boost for us, not just in trial design, but also in terms of our evidence generation tactics. And then for the new therapy areas like IgAN, nephropathy, or others, there weren't any benchmarks. And so you had quite a bit of freedom and flexibility to price products as you wanted to. Now, of course, if you were another blood pressure pill, it was probably a difficult environment, right? So depending on where you were entering, especially in the rare areas or acute, there was a lot of flexibility with defining what your value proposition looks like. And defining that value proposition allows you flexibility then to create sort of a new value benchmark. And the last thing here is the patient orgs, which I already mentioned before. Leveraging them to really make their voice amplified, I think, is a huge opportunity, especially for a small biotech like us. So our industry is going through a wild time right now, right? There's all these things you've heard in presentations earlier today, crazy stuff going on. US slaps tariffs on you one day, right? Then they say UK pay your fair share. Then people list in different markets, and just it's chaos all over the place, right? So I think, at least in small companies and big alike, senior leadership has never been challenged with market access the way they've been challenged in the last few years. So I bet there's times you or your boss or people on your team have been called and said, did you see that tariff thing? What does that mean for us? And all of a sudden, there's a new importance to what you do on a daily basis. Because I think they got complacent. They thought market access was just for building budget impact models or for, putting utilities in a trial and, mapping them after. They thought they were just there to help medical develop their evidence. But all of a sudden, they started seeing that there's these multiple impacts coming to fruition in the real world today. You're starting to see the US actually get teeth in some of its efforts to negotiate price, trying to cut out middlemen and go straight to the consumer. So at no time has it been better to be a market access person, because the lights and the action are on all of you right now. And I say this as a market access guy. My title says one thing, but I'm a market access guy. So with all these things going on, we also have a time when the market's contracting and jobs are being cut, right? It's a tough environment out there. Lots of companies are laying off people because there's new expectations for bottom line. And so proving your value becomes even more important within your companies. And I think there's no better time than now to show that value. And the way to do that, I think, is by showing how agile you can be, because in this environment where things are changing with a tweet from Trump on a Friday, and then Monday you're having meetings, there's no reason not to now implement some of these agile characteristics into your daily practice. So this is a question. Before I saw one of the Bayer guys, is there anyone from Bayer in here? They all ran away. All right, so I was going to call them out, but anyways, here we go. So last year, I presented on this DSO initiative that they put in place at Bayer. It was a big experiment, right? It comes from this human economics, like this humanocracy book. It was Gary Hamel who published this idea that, you need to socialize and push things down and declutter. And Bayer has just been cutting folks left and right? So I wanted to see where they were in this process. There's nobody in the room today, but I can tell you from earlier sessions this morning, there's a lot of things I heard him say. Mike, this was one of the first presenters, or second, because you guys went first, I think, instead. And what he talked about was how they were running multiple pilots, and they were getting more people engaged in driving these pilots forward and seeing if they floated or not, and then scale up, right? Which is a core dimension to it. But I'm curious to see how Bayer does with this, because the model and the effort is ambitious. And I hope what they're doing reflects biotech, but I also think there's challenges. Let me talk about three. I was going to call Mike out, but he's not here. So 3 things that I think really make it tough in big companies, and you should just be aware of these, because these are things, if you take back and you try to implement, you should understand where some of these no-go zones are, right? Because these no-go zones are sensitive areas, or areas you can trip up. The first has to do with market versus global. Sometimes it's your regional GM who wants to protect you from everything in global because they want you to focus on the market, right? And sometimes global wants to protect you from everything global because they want to justify their job and they want to control their intimacy with the science. And so there's always this tension between market and global in terms of who does what. And truly, whoever's closest to the consumer or the customer, whether that's a payer or physician, should be responsible for that person, right? Whoever's closest to the science, to the data, should be responsible for that. It's the intersection between both, and it's the operating models of companies that somehow interject with a regional apparatus, or they create a new, platform for working together that just doesn't respect sort of ways of working that would make you fast and agile. So I'd be cognizant of that. The last thing here is, this go-to-market strategy. Sometimes there's huge barriers with what the roadmap looks like. So I remember this morning you said you created something back in the day at GSK, right? It was like a playbook, right? Just cut, paste, run the playbook, right? It's like, we're here, time to run the playbook. And it's really easy as a manager to understand what the expectations are when you get a playbook. You just fill the playbook in, you run the playbook, right? But playbooks can also stifle you from sort of breaking out of there, because what if one section was left blank? Oh my God, what would you do, right? Maybe you'd try something different. But if everybody tried something different in a big company like GSK, it would be chaos. And you'd get very inconsistent outcomes and probably subpar performance. So some of these things, again, are barriers. You have to be respectful and watch out for them. But I was saying, if you're going to take some of these recommendations I have in the next few slides, I would say be mindful of these and try to understand where you can and can't innovate in your organization. So the advantage of the biotech mindset. So there's 4 kind of key pillars that I see to having a biotech mindset that you can bring into a big company, right? We'll talk about the first column today, but there's 3 others with the collaboration that are super important, the focus on what you're doing and clarity of purpose. Sometimes it's not that straightforward. And the culture of ownership, who actually owns something. Those things are equally important, but today is about agility because that's what the organizers asked me to address. So let's talk about how we be fast and not break things, okay? So in terms of agility, right, it's these things about making decision-making shorter, approval times faster. And if you really want to know where you might want to spend some time, think about what takes the most time in your organization, right? Think about those things that take disproportionately long time to fix, that if you could just shorten even 30%, it would make a huge difference in your daily life. The other thing is you want to be able to pivot, right? Agility is about being able to change direction. And I think this is something we could do a lot better with. I'll give you some examples of how you can do that on a day-to-day basis. So leadership, being agile in terms of your leadership, really has 4 pieces here, because agile working is not just for the sake of it. It's not just so that you can say that you wanted to be agile, right? There's these things that you can do on a day-to-day basis. The first is sprints and iterations. And so this was an example that was given by the Bear folks this morning about pilots. It's another word for these sprints, right? A sprint, by definition, is just run fast and hard real quick and then be done with it and then move on, right? And so we can experiment, and I think particularly smaller markets are good experiment ecosystems. So Austria is really motivated. There's a great person in Switzerland. It's rare that Germany is going to step out on a limb and not do the playbook, right? But some of these smaller markets, Portugal, they might have really great people in place. They might have structures that mirror a lot of the big markets. And so I think the more you can encourage these sprints to occur and allow others to lead and grow up, the better off you are. Continuous feedback goes along with this sort of transparency piece, right? It takes a while, but as a leader, you need to tell people when things are and are not going right, and then say, but that's okay. So think about your POA meetings or your big brand meetings. When's the last time somebody actually acknowledged that somebody tried something and it didn't work out, but it was great the way they approached it, right? Acknowledging that it's okay to fail, that it's okay to try. And I think in different cultures, trying and failing is looked at differently than in the US, for instance, where it's much more encouraged. So you want to be really open to making sure that continuous feedback is part of how you run things. And then you say, okay, well, how could we get better? Would you have done anything differently to make it work better, et cetera? And then adaptation. I'll give you some examples on the next slide how we do that. But essentially, you need to be able to do this and cultivate the soft factors around the team as well, right? Because the team needs to be bought into this idea. And that's another reason why I wanted to see how Bear thought it was going. So let's talk about planning, right? Because planning is another big piece. One is leading, another's planning, and then there's all the details of what you want to do. So when you think about planning, I think One of the things we don't do enough is to look at the different scenarios that we might be facing. Pharma is really good at looking at TPP scenarios, maybe good at looking at competitive scenarios. You know, like if there's a hot race to who's going to be first to market, maybe you'll run a scenario on, are we first or are they first? Crazy, right? That's so crazy. But it's really not that crazy. It's kind of boring, right? If you really sat down and you just spent an hour in your POAs or your brand meetings and you talked about, okay, what other things would dramatically impact our approach? Well, there is an incumbent. What if they did something? What if the US decided to, let's say, negotiate for all drugs that impacted Part B, not just those that are in the top, 50, 100. So you can start to break all these things down, and then you can prioritize which ones are those that are likely to happen, unlikely, which ones are the biggest impact. And at least then you have a short list. And I'll come back to that on this last point here, because I think that short list would give all of you that are sitting in this room today something to talk about with these random people you're meeting, right? So like instead of saying, hey, I'm Alex, I live in Barcelona, I work for a small company, you could say, yeah, I'm really interested in learning more about the manufacturer price negotiations. Have you been exposed to that? Oh, no? Oh, wow. Yeah, I'm really worried about X, Y, and Z. And then you hear from externals what is happening. It's kind of like an early warning system. But you can also refine your views internally to the likelihood of something occurring or not occurring. And so I think having a list that's beyond my TPP scenarios, or whether somebody launches in front of me or not, I think is extremely important for you guys to have scenarios that are built down. I also try to reserve chunks of budget for experimentation. So it's usually a 90-10 rule or something. 90% goes to the blocking and tackling, getting the core model, getting the dossier, et cetera, whatever built. But then you gotta let people experiment. Otherwise, how are they gonna do sprints, right? And that's where a lot of these new vendors that you'll meet at this conference, they'll say, oh, I have a new approach to blank. Have you ever thought of it this way? No, tell me more. Here's something I'm struggling with. And they can sort of build a concept out, and then at least you have some money there. And if you're continually providing feedback on the end of a project, then you can say, okay, so do we really need to do another $500,000 SKP value messaging story? Do we really need to do that? Or could we just throw people in a room for like a day and see if anything's changed and say, I think we're still good with last year's value story project, right? Because this happens all the time. It's so much waste. But imagine if you could spend that money somewhere else on something cool that might actually help you pivot or change the game. So when I look at these things, the last piece there is on outside experts. I usually create payer evidence panels or payer advocate panels, and they're usually ex-payers because current payers are problematic. But usually what I do is I set this network up, and then I'll have them on retainer so I can call them with any issue. And usually what I do as a team, as a department, is I'll set up every quarter a payer evidence council meeting. And there will be 3 questions we'll throw out to them at a couple weeks before the panel. So the team can be there, they can ask questions. It becomes an early warning system, so if you do need to pivot, right, it can be on your list of top things that you worry about for scenario planning. If you start to get a sense that something might be happening there, it's another way of getting feedback from the market. You don't depend on the affiliates for that, right? You can get that directly from the horse's mouth. I think it's also interesting because then these topics can be addressed with these folks, or you can have them explore them in depth individually within a given country. So we do a lot, and it doesn't cost a lot of money. It just takes somebody who's agile and has the capacity to deal with a payer council like that. So here you see what I would say I would prioritize, at least what I encourage in my team for the agile mindset, because not everybody's a leader, but at least they need to make sure that they understand that everything we do for patients, right? And so there's many times I've been in organizations or meetings where we're arguing over who does what or what needs to happen and why. And I think you just need to sometimes cut through the smoke and say, what's best for the patient here? Why are we doing this? Is this extra value story project really gonna help us? Is it gonna help patients? Like, is there something else we could do that's more core to the brand? So I think you gotta be able to, again, recognize what your primary objective is, what your goal is. As I said before, you need to be able to empower teams. Some team managers are better or worse at this. My recommendation is if you have a controlling manager, you leave. Life is too short to work for shitty people. I also think you need to run these sprints, okay? Fail fast and move on if you need to, or learn fast and then scale. I think scaling up is probably more hard than doing the sprints. Running the sprints is just money and finding motivated team members, which usually there are. Scaling it up becomes more of the challenge, and then you need those leaders to guide. And the last thing here, again, is transparent communication, making sure you have the ability to talk to people and tell them what you think. So the other three are still important. I can't talk about them today, maybe at a future meeting. Maybe next year we'll talk about something else. But I would stop here with the last 12 seconds and ask you guys what the barriers you think are organizationally from stopping you from moving fast in your company, and maybe other ways that you've thought of that you could overcome these. Anything?
I think too many layers, right? So being in a big company now, coming from a smaller biotech company, there are many more layers than before when it comes to decision making.
Yeah.
Sometimes you get frustrated because it takes so long time and you don't even get a yes or no. And then, why should I do it then? So I think that could be one thing.
Another reason the Bayer people should be here, because that's what they were trying to address, right? With the whole DSO initiative, they've been cutting, trying to delayer. And I don't know if it's worked, but certainly there also is a limit, right? The organization's so big. I think when I get to a certain number of direct reports, it's really tough to have one-to-one with them on a regular basis to be able to guide and coach and manage and develop. So I think there's a trade-off there, but certainly there's a lot of fat. Right? There's way too much fat in the system, and that fat slows down the communication if decision-making is driven at the top or the mid-top.
But also giving that trust,
Yeah.
that freedom to act, I think is equally important.
Yeah.
Because you don't have to go to the manager every time. The manager has to go to the manager, and then it's like, why do we have the people?
We've become really risk-averse. I remember back in the day, in the 2000s, we created a Goliath. We did some pretty bad things with promotional activities, and we created the Goliath we had to slay. So I understand why it became such a tightly regulated, managed business. We became risk averse. The feedback I always received as I was growing up in that age was there's like an asymmetry of risk reward, right? If you go and speak at ASCO on value of cancer drugs, what happens if one tweet goes out and our stock drops $1 billion? It's like, well, that would be bad. And then your job's on the line, okay? But what if it goes really good? Nothing. People respect our industry better, and it feels right, and that's what we should be doing. We should fight for ourselves. But that asymmetry of risk reward made us super conservative, especially big companies. Smaller companies were still a little wild, right? But I don't have the same legal team looking over my back. I don't have a product on the market, so I don't have the same rules against me for what I can say and not say. So some of these things I think we created, over time, I think they'll swing back because they'll find it's just not efficient to have people risk averse and afraid. I'd ask the Bayer person about that too. But any other thoughts or questions?
So my view is I think it's got to come from the board level to create that culture. Your last column, the expression culture is strategy any day. So it's got to be mandated at senior level to allow it to experiment and fail fast. Until you have that cultural thing, nuances, it's kind of difficult. Like you say, we are risk averse for many good reasons, namely the fact that we are controlled so tightly by regulatory implications.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's weird because some boards, so I've worked in now public companies, I've worked in private companies that have diverse boards, deep long-term boards, and I've worked in private companies that have VCs that want out, right? And the interest in the level of engagement and the activities, the types of things they do are super different. And sometimes the CEOs really manage the board as sort of like, I have to do this thing, right? It's an obligation, but it's not a strategic decision-making body. In others, they can become incredibly strategic, and they can be all about taking big risks, right? But it tends to be more with those that are open to risk, like the VC-oriented small private biotechs, where we have a lot less to lose.
I have a question about what kind of projects would be okay to fail with when you mentioned that?
So we did one, I could think of a bunch, but one of them that we did that I thought was really cool, we created this rapid CI tool for pricing, which is like ripe with like danger, right? Because pricing information is so sensitive, it's so whatever. But we had this tool, this app on the phones, and it was called Goldfish. We just named it Goldfish. We said, hey, if you find anything out about activities or behaviors or whatever you're hearing from the market, send it in. And then we could de-identify it, and we could aggregate it and have rapid feedback from all of our key account managers, right? big company that we were working with, partnering with, was like shocked because they were worried about antitrust and price collusion and whatever. So we said, don't worry, we'll do it. So we did it ourselves with the appropriate boundaries. We made sure to train them on what's appropriate behavior and what to and not put in there, because that's also important too, to protect risk. But we rapidly rolled that out, and we started getting feedback in, and then we would share this information that we would get with our partners at Big Pharma, and they're like, oh man, this is super helpful, right? Super helpful. Then we're like, okay, well, do you guys want to get your team involved? Oh no, we could never do that. So examples like that, then we scaled it because we started in Benelux, where we had a lot of key accounts in the Netherlands, and then we expanded it to other countries like Spain and Italy, where we also had lots of key account managers. So that's an example. We've done other stuff internally with like AI, right, which still has lots of limitations to content creation. We've done some stuff in different approaches to meetings, right? Even simple things like having your team drive sessions instead of you or the brand lead or somebody else, right? There's a lot of stuff you can do just to see if it works fast. Okay, good questions. Thank you guys for your time. Thank you guys. Back to you.